In May 2021, Murrindindi Climate Network and the Home Creek Spring Creek Landcare Group extended an invitation to a farm forestry field day held at a working tree farm in Hodson's Lane, Kanumbra in northeast Victoria. The event featured 4 speakers talking on the why, what and how of farm forestry, followed by a Q&A session and then a walk through the trees. The Kanumbra plantation was established in 2008 when 35 hectares of plantation sawlog trees and 20 hectares of bioenergy trees were established on a 160 hectare property just north of Yark in northeastern Victoria. The field day on Sunday 16th of May was attended by 60 people, including the Mayor, 3 councillors and the CEO of Murrindindi Shire. The Federal Member of Parliament for Indi, Dr Helen Haynes, was also present with her husband, as well as 2 representatives from VicForests, the state forestry organisation. MC for the day was Bob Flowers, a well-known local identity and former Mayor of the Shire of Murrindindi.
The impetus for today, what's actually brought this about, probably is that the government plans to phase out the logging of native forests by 2030. Not that far away. And at this stage, how that transition is to be made over a period of 8 years or a little more is really unclear. And so what has happened is that to this end, Regional Development Victoria has opened a grant funding opportunity and that is to establish a local plan for selected areas of Victoria. And one of these selected areas is Alexandra, Marysville and the Triangle, which we all know has produced one heck of a lot of logs of different qualities, but certainly heaps of them over a long period of time. And that really is to be discontinued in its present form. Now, one alternative is to native timber logging, obviously, is to increase farm forestry of hardwood on marginal agricultural land in our district. And the idea of today is to showcase what can be done and has been done. And hence the Murrindindi Climate Network is making a positive and, I believe, very constructive contribution by showcasing farm forestry and its potential in this district. Our first speaker is Tony Richardson. Tony is the co-owner with Rita Seetaylor of this farm here at Kanumbra. Tony was a civil engineer by training and spent 40 years working in the field of transport planning, academia, government and consulting. And the environmental impacts of the transport industry led him to an involvement with trees, as they offered a way of offsetting the greenhouse emissions from transport. Today he will explain in more detail why he got involved in farm forestry. I'd like to introduce Tony Richardson. Thank you.
What I'm going to talk about is the why of farm forestry for our particular situation. And then the following speakers will talk about the what is farm forestry and how do you do it, and what are some of the other benefits. So from my point of view, or our point of view, there was really 3 reasons why we got involved in farm forestry. Carbon, timber and super. I mean superannuation, not superphosphate. So let me just go quickly through each of those 3 to explain why. As most of you probably know, as trees grow, they absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through photosynthesis that's stored in the tree itself. The carbon that's in the tree actually stays in the timber for an extended period, even if the trees are harvested. Some research done by New South Wales DPI, a long time study, long time series, found that about 70% of the carbon in harvested timber is still within those products that are made from the timber 100 years hence. So about 70% continues, and it continues in the strangest ways. Obviously in building timbers, they're long-lived, but even in things like paper and cardboard, if that's disposed of in an anaerobic tip, it doesn't decompose. When they did this study, they opened up some of the tips around Sydney, which were very old, and they found they could read the newspapers from 1912 that had been buried. So the carbon is still there. If they hadn't dug it up, it would have still been there. So harvested timber can have a long life with carbon, as does a permanent forest. If you just grow the trees and let them grow, then they'll obviously contain the carbon. One important point, however, is that once trees have grown to essentially their full size, they stop sequestering carbon. That's an active process. They stop absorbing carbon, but they keep storing the carbon that's already in the tree. So old trees are very good at storing carbon, but not at sequestering new carbon. Whereas the harvested forest, if you harvest that after say 25 years and plant again, then you get a whole bunch of new trees who are growing, absorbing more carbon, whilst the carbon in the harvested trees remain in the timber. So you actually get a gradual increase over time, so that a harvested forest or rotation of harvested forests can actually contain more carbon and has sequestered more carbon than a permanent forest. Back in 2005, when we were thinking of our first plantation, which was at Taggart, we found by talking to a lot of people around the region that there were a lot of people who were growing trees on their farms. And with the carbon market that was then being put in place, they found, however, that it was just too difficult, paperwork-wise, to apply for compensation or payment for the trees' carbon absorption. So we started a little company called TreeSmart, which acted as a broker, or it's now called an aggregator, to put together a whole bunch of tree farmers so that they could actually take part in that scheme without having to do all the paperwork themselves. We did that for them. We ended up with about, I think it was 101 different farmers, with about 2,500 hectares of trees in that scheme. But the demise of the emissions trading scheme in the late 2000s meant that went onto the back burner for us for many years. Recently, however, the federal government has an emissions reduction fund which will pay for carbon sequestration or carbon emissions avoidance, either way. And they create what are called ACCUs, Australian Carbon Credit Units, which can be accredited for projects after they go through a measurement process to see what they're actually absorbing or avoiding, which can then be sold on either to the government in an auction or on a secondary market to private companies and others who wish to offset their emissions. Many of you have probably seen the Victoria Bitter beer commercials these days emphasising that they're carbon neutral. They have actually just come up in the last month or so with a new scheme, and it's now on the football grounds, saying solar beer exchange. It's like the secondary market for offsets, but they don't pay in money, they pay in beer. It's a very clever scheme if you think about it, because what they're giving in exchange is beer at their cost price, and what the other person's receiving is beer which would have been at retail price. So they can actually make quite a good deal to get people to offset, to create the offsets in the first place, and then for Big Bitter to offset their production. So that's given us more feeling for what's going on in the future. In fact, the value of the carbon credits that one can obtain from something like this forest, over time, over the 20-25 years of harvesting, will be equal value to the timber that comes out of the forest. And one important thing is that for the timber you've got to wait 25 years to get any reward when you sell the timber. The carbon credits, you're getting them continuously through those 25 years. And that actually offsets the cost of keeping the farm forest in good condition to maximise both the timber growth and the carbon sequestration. So, carbon was one of the reasons, but the more natural reason that most people think of is the timber. One of the things we learnt from our initial contact with John Woodley, who we just happened to bump into at the Taggart stall one day, was that plantations can grow high quality trees much quicker than a native forest, and in about 20 to 25 years they're big trees. This plantation, we had one of the loggers come up a couple of weeks ago just to see whether he thought that something like this could be a substitute for native logging. And we drove him through the plantation, and then at the end of it we said, well, how old do you think the plantation is? And he looked at the trees and he said, oh, 20, 25 years. This plantation is 11 years old. But because they've been taken care of, and as John will talk about with the silviculture, the pruning and the thinning and a whole bunch of other things, they actually can grow quite substantially. Our favourite tree, and I think it's the biggest in the property, I've looked at all of them and I can't find one bigger, is the one straight behind you on the right, on the end of the row there. And that's 50 centimetres diameter at breast height, which is the official measurement. We were thinking of growing these trees on till they're 60 centimetres, and this at 11 years is already at 50. So you can get good quality timber, and as you'll see, it's straight, so it's going to provide good timber in relatively short times. And as Bob was saying, the cessation of native forest logging in 2030 has given us another reason to start looking at the timber production from farm forestry and other types of plantations as well. We're talking particularly about farm forestry, which is sort of small land holdings on private land. There's also a lot of other plantation forestry going on in the rest of the state, but that's not what we're talking about. One question that we often get is, when should you plant trees? And every forester I've ever talked to has the same answer.
Now.
It's either now or 20 years ago. And that was the same answer I got 20 years ago. When I was thinking of planting some trees, I said, is it a good time to plant? Oh, there's only two good times to plant trees. It's either now or 20 years ago. And it's still true. Now, we're lucky because our trees in 2030 will be 22 years old and they'll be reaching their full size. But for those who don't have trees now is the best time to start. And now is not the best time to rain.
No.
It won't. It'll stop. Okay, so timber is obviously a reason, but it wasn't the only reason for us. Strangely, I guess the trigger for us, given all these other things going on in our mind, was the idea of superannuation. We, running our own company, we had a self-managed super fund, and it went into the usual places that self-managed super funds put their money into, the stock market and so on. And we were watching it, and it was going okay, but we just didn't like the idea of the money just sitting in the stock market. It's just as exciting walking through the stock market as the supermarket. So we asked our accountant, it was a bit of a far-flung idea we put to him, can we run a farm forestry thing with our super fund? We invest in trees. And he wasn't quite sure, but he went away and looked at it, came back a while later and said, yes, you probably can under certain conditions. One is that the super fund cannot run a business, cannot operate a business. It's investing in something. It's not running anything. So that came up with the idea that the super fund owns this land that we're standing on, but our company grew all the trees. So the company paid for the establishment, the silviculture, everything that goes into running the thing. And we pay rent to the super fund every year. So we're renting this land off the super fund, which becomes the super fund's income, which keeps the ATO happy, because the super fund has to make a return on their investments. They can't be dummy investments. The other thing that our accountant said to us was that, well, yes, you can invest in these sorts of things, but one rule that they insist on is that you don't enjoy it. Now, what they meant was you can't buy an apartment on the Gold Coast and then go and live in it yourself. That's called enjoying your asset, and that's a no-no. So we promised him that when we come up to look at the trees, we won't enjoy them. And he's not here today. He did come to the very opening of the Taggart Farm Forestry, but unfortunately couldn't be here today to hear that we were stuck to our promise, and we walk around here with a glum face every time. Just to finish, in the handout that you've got, there's what we call an input-output tree. That's my freehand version of what's slightly better drawn in the input. So on the back of my notes, you'll see that. And I find this a very useful way to think about the various things that go on with farm forestry, particularly in terms of what inputs are required and what outputs. Because often we think of it too narrowly. We think of it as just timber. But the sort of things you've got to put in, firstly, time, definitely. You can't do farm forestry quickly. Money, we know that. Equipment, labour, seedlings, water, nutrients, CO2 goes into it, and it gets sequestered. And coming out, you can get saw logs, you can get peeler logs where they get veneer from the log. There are lots of other timber products that could come out of it. Bioenergy, a fancy name for firewood, I guess, but it's in other ways as well, where it's not just our normal firewood, but in various fuels made from timber. Shade and shelter for the cattle, and in case anyone thinks we don't have cattle on here, just watch where you're walking. Sequestered carbon we've talked about, flowers for the birds and the bees and other things, seeds that you can gather and use for regeneration down the line. And we don't enjoy this place, but we do get some serenity out of it. Thank you, Bob.
Our second speaker today is Clinton Pepper, and Clinton was responsible for the design and early management of this Kanumbra tree farm when he worked for Heartwood Plantations. He now runs his own company, Just Add Trees, which specialises in helping farmers to integrate trees on both small and large scale farms to improve their productivity and resilience. Today he will describe the procedures involved in the planning and monitoring of farm forestry plantations. Clinton, thank you very much indeed.
When I got the invitation to speak, it caused me to reflect on many other times that I've spoken at these sort of events, and I cast my mind back to 1997, which is when I started getting involved in farm forestry, and it sort of made me also think about the millions of trees I've been fortunate to be involved with in a planting sense, and in a management sense, and a harvesting sense. And I had to ask myself the question, over 23, 24 years, many of you here will have your own trees. I've got my own trees, but so many people in the farming landscape don't. And I ask yourself why? Why is it that farm forestry, at many levels, hasn't taken off? It's always been around the periphery of land use on farms. So I ask you, why do you think that is the case? There's many reasons why that's the case. But one of them that I was going to highlight for you today is that whilst some people, I reckon you'd probably say a small subset of people, have been really happy with the returns they've got from their trees, they've been very happy with the ancillary benefits. For many people, the most important benefits are things like shade and shelter and ecosystem restoration, carbon sequestration, improved biodiversity, all these sorts of things. There's a lot of people that have planted trees that actually aren't that happy with the outcome. the outcome hasn't met their expectations. And today I'm here to help you develop realistic expectations about farm forestry. And one of the best ways we can develop realistic expectations is to know our objectives. This sort of thing, farm forestry, as you can see here today, it's a long-term thing to be involved with, but it's also something that can create a wonderful legacy. You know, to be thinking about farm forestry, you really need to be thinking about the next generation and the one after that. If you're not, you're at a big risk of not having the right expectations as to what this can do. So before you commit to farm forestry, you need to know your why. You need to know why you want to plant trees. Why do you want to be involved in farm forestry? If you don't know your why, it's highly probable you won't meet your expectations and you'll be one of those people who is only so happy about the trees they planted. Maybe they regret it. So when you know your objectives, you're on your way to creating something that really meets those inner expectations. It puts a smile on your dial. In subsequent generations are really appreciative of your efforts. So your objectives in farm forestry can be a range of things. I've already mentioned a few, but we're here today to talk a lot about timber production. That might be a priority for some of you, but a higher priority for many of you might be shade and shelter. It might be carbon sequestration. It might be land protection, protecting your land against erosion. It may be to improve agricultural production. There's a range of benefits that trees can provide. And it's worth noting that in the almost 25 years I've been involved with trees on farms, that the happiest, most satisfied tree growers that I've seen are in it for way more than the money. And in fact, I'd feel very comfortable being bold to say that people that get involved with trees just for the money are often not happy. Trees can offer you a lot more than money. They can make money, and the proof of that is the fact that major superannuation companies have a percentage of their funds in things like trees. But if you're money focused and you're thinking that trees are your ticket to winning the lottery, you're in it for the wrong things. You're better off doing something else. You might be better off going into the stock market, or you might be better off getting into property. Trees can be very fulfilling, but you need to know your why, and if it's just money, there's a risk there that you won't be happy. I'm here to tell you today that trees can do much more than just make money. So a core business of what I do, my business is called Just Add Trees, and the first thing, probably my biggest job when someone comes to me is to find out what their objectives are, and if they don't know, by the time they finish with me, they should. And it could well be they actually come out of that discussion and say, yeah, maybe I shouldn't be planting trees. Or maybe I should. But they need to know their why before they start, otherwise they will not meet their expectations. So, your objectives, my objectives won't be your objectives. And the fella up the back, his objectives won't be Elaine's objectives here at the front. In farm forestry, your objectives are your own and your site is your own. So whatever planting you are engaged in, if it's truly to fulfill your objectives, it will be different to your neighbours. So be very wary of recipes. Farm forestry has the capacity to meet your objectives, meet your expectations, but it's highly likely it will be different to the person down the road who's also engaged in it. If you came to me and your interest was timber, and it was a high priority for you, I'd point you in the direction of farm forestry. If you came to me and you love your trees, and your priority was sort of equal between farm forestry and agriculture, I'd point you to something like multi-storey farming, which is an integration of trees into agricultural land. It's not a replacement, and the two industries exist side by side. And if it's done right, they can actually benefit one another. So once you know your objectives, you need to look at your site. And there's many things that you look at a site before you actually decide, yeah, I'm going to go ahead with it. You know, when Tony and Rita or other people come to me and they're looking at farm forestry as a potential land use, and they take me to their site, I've obviously had the objective talk with them, and I can usually tell within 1 or 2 hours whether their site has the capacity to meet their objectives. Sometimes it doesn't. I had the misfortune of going to a fella's property one day, 590 acres, not far from here. He was very determined and firm in what he wanted to do with his farm forestry objectives. After a 2-hour drive around his place, I got about 1 hour into it, and I'm thinking, this will be an interesting discussion at the end, because less than 20% of his property was going to be able to do what he wanted. And in that 20%, pretty much he wanted to run a livestock operation, so that left nothing for farm forestry. So he'd done the wrong thing. He'd gone out, he just bought it. He literally bought it the week before, then he got me out. He hadn't done the research. He hadn't looked at things like mean annual rainfall, soil type, depth, the altitude of the site, the aspect of the site. So he hadn't done, he had southern aspects on his property which were, you know, quite moist, not bad for tree growing, but he had a lot of northern aspect as well, which weren't as great. So they're things that you need to look at. But one of the biggest clues to actually determining whether your site's going to actually achieve your objectives is to look at the native forest on the site, or to look at plantations in the area. Native forest, existing plantations, providing they've got a bit of age on them like these, are really, really good for telling you whether your site can achieve your objectives. And if you don't have a property yet, and you're here today, and you're considering farm forestry, just make sure you know what your objectives are, and you know what sort of site you need to achieve those objectives. Because I really don't want any of you to go out and buy a property that's just not going to meet your objectives. Tony and Rita were quite clever when they purchased this place, and before they purchased it, they asked me to come and have a look. And within an hour or two, I thought, you know, it's actually this can achieve what they want to achieve. And not only did they get me to do that, but they arranged for me to do soil pits. So we did 20 soil pits on the place before they actually purchased it, just to make sure, just to dot those I's and cross those T's. And as a result, we were actually able to put together a really good design on this place because we were equipped with the knowledge. Soil nutrition is another thing that we look at in soil pits. In that when we do soil pits, we look at the physical nature of the soil, so things like how deep it might be, its texture, its colour, how well drained is it, and we dig them to 3 metres. We also look at the chemistry of the soil, and you look at the biology of the soil as well. There's those 3 components you need to look at. And unfortunately, soil nutrition is a critical and it's frequently overlooked part of tree growing. It's a common adage that native trees don't require fertiliser, or they don't require much. But that particular conclusion ignores the fact that often properties that people buy for the express purpose of doing farm forestry have a history of their resources being taken and taken and taken over decades without them being replenished again. And because of that, you know, trees, they'll do their best with what they're given, but they can do a lot better if you have a balanced nutrition on the farm. If you may well have advisors that talk to you about soil nutrition, and if they're not talking to you about macro minerals and micro minerals or trace minerals and soil biology, if they're only talking to you about nitrogen and phosphorus, you need to find a new one. It's It's as simple as that. You won't grow the trees that can achieve your objectives if your site doesn't have balanced nutrition. An example of that is a property that I managed at Yarram. The recommendation was to fertilise this site before it was planted, but for one reason or another that wasn't done. Spotted gum was planted, and unfortunately it didn't go up. It grew sideways. And not only did it grow sideways, it grew 2 metres sideways, and then it decided to go up. And that was because there was a very simple to diagnose trace mineral deficiency. So always address your soil mineral balance, otherwise your trees might not go up, they might go sideways. So your plantation design, just quickly, on this site, the site is being designed with the knowledge of the soil pits and the differences in moisture of aspects, where we've got blue gum on the flats primarily, and then we grade into sugar gum and then spotted gum in the upper slopes. It really mirrors what happens in native forest, that where you go up the slope, where you change aspects, species frequently change. There's a central access track through here that many of you have, or you've driven on to get here. That was important for a lot of reasons as well. We perhaps clarify those later, because we're running out of time. So planting stock is another thing that we needed to talk about, that Tony was keen to talk about today. The key message with planting stock is that at home I grow a lot of lucerne in amongst my trees, and when you're selecting a new lucerne seed, there might be 100 different varieties you could choose. Well, farm forestry seed lots for species aren't as well developed as that, but you need to select the seed that's appropriate to your property. Local seed is often best, not always, but mostly. And what you don't want to do is leave that to the nursery to decide. They don't know your site, they don't know your objectives. You need to decide that for yourself. And finally, monitoring. So the biggest risk to a farm forest is poor management. You can spend the money, have great advice, put the trees in, like Tony and Rita have done, but if you then stand back and expect the trees to do the rest, you've got another thing coming. Because if you do that, they won't tend to meet your objectives or your expectations. If your objectives are to produce timber, well, the trees will grow, they'll look after themselves okay, but they won't produce clearwood because you haven't pruned. They'll grow tall and thin because you haven't thinned. And as a result, you won't be getting what you expected at the marketplace. And the final thing to talk about with monitoring, management, is that it's very important that you assess your trees every year through what's called a permanent sample plot system, or a PSP, because that allows you to manage your trees based on science. Way better doing that, and you'll see as you walk through that there is plots amongst the trees that have got tape on them. So there might be 8 or 9 PSPs in here, and that actually equips Tony with the science that he needs to make thinning decisions, pruning decisions. Otherwise, it's just gut feel, and you don't want to be managing your plantation on gut feel. Thanks for your time.
Our next speaker is John Woodley. John Woodley is a man of note in a number of fields. One is a Grand Prix motorcyclist, rider, and also working for 20 years in forest logging in New Zealand and Australia. John established farm forestry silviculture in 1997 after moving to Taggart. John was responsible for the establishment of this plantation in 2008 and for most of the silviculture services over the last 13 years. John will describe just what was involved in those activities. Welcome, John.
Well, Clinton, what a great talk. And Tony, as the owner of this, you've given us a good overview of what you wanted to do. I'm very proud to have been involved with this plantation. The only thing I would have done differently is planted southern blue gum, not Tassie blue gum, simply because of its drought tolerance. I think the rest of the site's got good species for drought tolerance. The thing that was done right here was soil cultivation, deep ripping with the bulldozer. All of these tree lines were deep ripped, which made the establishment of the trees very good, because Australia is full of very old soil which is very compacted. So deep ripping with a winged ripper makes it much easier for the seedling roots to go deep and follow the moisture. The other thing that was done here was weed control to reduce competition from the grass. You can see the result, it's fantastic. Can you hold up the seedlings please, Bob? This is an example of good quality seedling stock. All of the seedlings that were planted on the site native were of high quality like this and a similar size. The pruning of the first 6 metres was done progressively over about 3 or 4 years, and in stages of 2 metres per lift to 6 metres, and we did the first non-commercial thin at about age 4 or 5. I think Clinton will confirm that, but we plant 1,000 stems a hectare to cover the genetic variation in the native trees. You'll notice when you first plant trees there'll be quite a variation in quality of the stems. With our silviculture management, we focus on the best trees. Here's an example here. This area, I don't think this was thin to waste originally, but you've got dominant trees and subdominant skinny trees. The idea is that we speed up nature with silviculture management. Instead of waiting for those trees to die, is what happens in a native forest. We cut them down early, and that allows the dominant trees to grow fatter more quickly. So we end up with our timber trees 60 centimetres in diameter in 25 to 30 years. That's the objective for me when I'm managing a timber plantation. Clinton touched on the nutrients, and that's been a very important thing for me. The trace elements that I've applied to my own trees mean that I've got some fantastic trees. Since I involved Clinton with the management, my trees have got even better. The second rotation performed very poorly until I involved Clinton. We put on liquid trace elements and lime, and the trees look completely different now. The other thing is the value of wattles amongst the crop trees. There seems to be a symbiosis that happens between wattles and eucalypts, which means that it's the silver wattle, which is hated by farmers because it dies and falls on the fences, is actually doing good work underneath the ground with nitrogen fixing. There has been some commercial thinning done already in this plantation. I don't I suspect that Tony and Rita didn't make their fortune from that.
No, we covered the cost.
Right, so it was cost neutral. This section of blue gums over here was commercially thinned, and that was a cost neutral exercise, but the value of that is that it's benefiting the trees that are remaining because they will grow fatter with less competition. You can see this section of blue gum behind us here wasn't thinned, and it will take much longer for those dominant trees to become the same size as these ones. There's a lot of coppicing in the spotted gums up here which didn't get sprayed, so it's become quite big again, and it's possible that Tony will have to get that cut down to reduce competition with the crop trees so they grow fat. Clinton's mention of the PSPs has been very valuable at my place, and I've got some fantastic trees because of his input. These timber specimens over here at my ute are all from my place, except the left-hand one, which is Eucalyptus bicostata. That's from Chris Tuck's plantation at the bottom of the Acheron cutting. I have that flooring on in my house, and it's beautiful hard timber. It's more drought tolerant than Tassie blue gum, and I think the timber is actually harder, better quality, but that's only my personal opinion. When I bought Taggart to set up a demonstration property to show farmers that we could actually grow very good trees and good timber trees on farms, Lloyd Gould said to me, "You're wasting your time. You'll never be able to grow trees that produce timber as good as the native forest. Have a look at those samples there, see what you reckon." I wish he was still alive today because he could see my trees and my timber and he might think again. One of the reasons that the timber industry insisted on having access to native forests was because they convinced the government that we couldn't grow quality trees and plantations. That was just one reason. I hope that we've already proved them wrong.
Our fourth and final speaker today is Philippa Noble. Philippa has been involved in farm forestry for over 25 years, and that included working for the Department of Primary Industry, where she was responsible for North East Firewood Strategy, being a board member of the Farm Forestry North East, and establishing her own farm forestry on her property near Rutherglen. Today she will talk about the ancillary benefits of establishing farm forestry plantations on farm. Thank you very much, Philippa.
Thank you for the opportunity, because I love being able to promote trees and help people to establish trees and put in more trees in our landscape. We've done a lot of clearing over the last few hundred years, and we do need to replace them. And we all have our different objectives for doing that. So I'll just run through some of the things that I'm going to talk about. Firstly, our experiences on my own property in farm forestry, and then some of the benefits that we've achieved from farming, and also for the benefits from wildlife, and then a little bit touch on my timber and carbon storing. So we moved up there about nearly 30 years ago, and one of the first things we did when we bought our property, which was up on the Murray River at Brimmen, near Rutherglen, and so it's a very different property to this. It's a lot lower rainfall, but we did have a little bit of irrigation, and we've got 6 kilometres of Murray River frontage, so we've actually got red gum country and flood country. So we had to keep that in mind whenever we were doing things in the longer term. Initially the property was actually covered in goats, so it really was a blank canvas, and it had about 3 or 4 beautiful red gum remaining trees on the non-bush area, and so there was lots of improvements need to be made, and particularly with the irrigation area. You can imagine you graze the irrigation area a lot more, especially in summer, and these days grazing in summer you need shade. You need shade for in every paddock. First thing, as I said, we did a whole farm plan, and it's Clinton mentioned that as well. But we were looking at farming the property as well as integrating trees into it. So I was looking for every nook and cranny where I could put trees, solid trees, and other than that, we put individual rows of trees or maybe shelter belts. And we aimed for maybe about 10,000, planting about 10,000 trees for timber production, and actually harvesting finally about 3,000 of them. So that was our aim, to integrate it into the farm. And our most successful trees, of course, have been those on the single rows. We put down the irrigation bays. Along the check banks, in between it was flood irrigation, and on the check banks the stock used to walk up and down, and of course they'd flatten the check banks. So we ended up putting individual trees along there, and as long laneways wherever we could, anywhere we could find that wasn't going to compromise the pastures. We fenced those tree lines with 2 wires of electric, putting good strainer posts at the end, and then just 1 wire at lamb height and 1 wire at ewe height, and that worked perfectly. So with cattle it would have been even easier, because you just probably have 1 wire. So I thoroughly recommend electric fencing for those first few years until the trees really get up and can cope. We had to take into account the species as well. Like, we were some of the floodplain, and we haven't actually mentioned species very much here. But when we first started, I was a farm forestry officer, and we'd looked at some of the research had been done, and a lot of the species that they recommended then were the ones that actually grew fastest early. But I've since found, not so much on our place, but around Rutherglen, in the low rainfall areas, it's the actual slower growing ones that are going to last there the longest. The faster they are growing, probably the quicker they will be to die. So although spotted gums are not too bad, and they're my actual favourite. And they're the ones that I wanted to plant. I knew it was good timber in the long run. I knew they grew nice and straight with minimal need for pruning, but they were frost sensitive, and we have a frosty area. So along our rows, I tended to do risk management. I'd put the spotted gum, but then I'd also put another species, which I used was Sydney blue gum. So I alternated with that, thinking, okay, if the spotted gums die from frost, then I've still got something growing there. Well, as it was, the spotted gums maybe were a bit knocked back, but they always regrew so well. So I had the hard decision then of which one do I take. And in some areas, I know that the spotted gums will be more drought tolerant. So climate change, next 20 years, I'm always looking, trees, you're looking in the long term, 20, 30 years, what will it be like? And we know that it's going to be tougher in the future. So I tend to still like my spotted gums, because I know they'll take it. And they've amazingly taken a lot of flooding as well, which has interested me too, because you don't normally see them in wet areas, so they're tough. But the Sydney blue gums have grown, the ones that I did leave, have grown really well. So from the farming aspects, the benefits of having our trees, and what is it called, multi-storey? It's integrated into the farm, so it's not. I've got some larger plantations, or woodlots, where we had a fish farm and we used effluent to actually water them. But some of the farming aspects, the benefits, of course, been in the lambing ewes. It's amazing how you can see little twins just sitting underneath a tree, and knowing that no matter what the weather, they'll always be able to get out of it, whether it's behind a stump or behind the leaves when they were younger. The shade has been huge, the shade. Particularly, I don't know if many of you are aware, but when temperatures get over 40 degrees or even over 35, rams can tend to go infertile. And so if you're starting to want to join them, you've got to wait another 6 weeks before they'll actually be fertile again. So again, having shade and keeping high humidity and coolness around makes a big difference. And going into the future, that will make even more of a difference. Of course, there's the working environment. The trees around the farm just make it the sight, the smell and the sounds. You know, just the sight of the visuals of the trees. Even when things are dry, there's always the green. Particularly the spotted gums have got a lovely green, fresh look. The sounds, it's amazing, not only the sound of the wind in the trees and the birds, but also the bees. Sometimes you can just go under the trees and you can just hear a buzz of bees, because my trees are now, most of them are big enough now for flowering. And of course, others have mentioned here the nutrient recycling of having trees on your farm, especially when you've got pasture underneath. They're bringing up nutrients from a lot deeper than pastures would. There's the pest control of your pastures, and also we had a little bit of salinity on our place when we first arrived, but since I've put trees around there, we've never seen salinity since. And even in some of those wetter years that we have had since, we've still never seen them. So that's the farming benefits. There are many that really help with the farm, but I still think the best is just the amenity and able to enjoy them every time you walk out the door. We have some accommodation on our property as well, tourist accommodation, and I think that has also helped. Everybody just loves coming to the farm because it just, rather than just a bare farm, it actually is a nice place for them to be. The wildlife benefits, of course, are huge, and some of them have been extra. From the animal point of view, I noticed a couple of times going along our laneways in the evenings, you'd see gliders flying through, and so we used to go spotlighting, and you see a lot of squirrel gliders, which are an endangered species. And since then I've put up a lot, so we do have, as I said, they were coming in from the bush and using the trees as a corridor to get to the feeding trees that were actually in flower. But I've put up a lot of nest boxes, and now each time I go around the nest boxes with my camera, at least half of the nest boxes have a little either family or a single squirrel gliders in them. So the area is alive, and I mean, open pasture, you're not going to get those. We've always got a few kangaroos. No, we haven't always. We used to never see kangaroos, but we do see a few now. Some people around here probably say there's too many, but I still enjoy. They enjoy my trees, and I'm happy with them there. The flying foxes also. We've got the bats have come in for the spotted gums flowering, and I never used to get them before, and now you can go out in the evenings and you can hear them chattering away, and you think, oh, that tree must be flowering down there, or over there, that tree's flowering. So, there's things that you just don't realise that are coming. And of course, there's the birds, and I'm really interested in birds, and we have a lot of birds. There's been a lot of research done on the benefits of plantations for birds, and I was involved in some research a fair few years ago now on open pastures, plantations and remnant bush, and the differences in the amount of birds. And plantations were by far a lot more species, particularly woodland bird species, than open pastures, of course. And it's the woodland bird species that are actually disappearing. And they were almost as good as the remnant vegetation. And of course, as they get older, they get even better. But the thing that's missing from a lot of our plantations is some of the understory. And so on my lines of trees, and where I try and put a block of understory or understory around the outside, I find that if you integrate into the trees, they usually die. The understory just gets competed away. So I tend to now, if we're doing a block of trees, just put a block of understory on its own, so it actually has a chance to actually grow and get going. Well, the insects and snakes, I was bird watching in my plantation the other day, and there's a snake kind of goes past, and that's all part of the biodiversity that I think we overlook. People tend to not like the idea of snakes, but to me that they're a sign that things are going well. There's enough food around for them to actually be surviving. And the other bit of research also highlighted the importance of putting trees and the value of the remnants. And I see in this plantation there's a few really good remnants left, like beautiful remnant trees here. Now, and one over there too, yeah, fantastic. And they really not only add value to your plantation, but of course your plantation has added huge value to that remnant. Because the remnants got the hollows as well. That's why I tended to have to put the nest boxes up, because the remnants often have the hollows and have a lot more nooks and crannies and aspects that maybe your younger trees don't have. So I thought I'd better mention some of the disadvantages of the trees, particularly integrated into farms. And it's been mentioned, I suppose, the labour and the initial cost, but that hasn't been a big issue for us because I've enjoyed it and it's better than going to the gym. But one of the things that we're noticing, they haven't competed with the lucerne under them, but they do tend to, particularly this is a species, the Sydney blue gums, and I think blue gums would, tend to drop sticks. And if you're going to go through and mow your lucerne or put a header through it, you have to make sure you pick up sticks that are big in that. So every time around the rows of trees, I've got to do a bit of stick picking. And even in our hay, we might get some leaves and some bark in the hay, and some people are a bit picky about that, and I'm not that keen on buying hay that might be a little bit contaminated. So that's an education thing, but it is that, you don't want to wreck your machines, so you do. That's been our major problem actually. And one of the other little ones that wasn't affected here, but we did mounding, and some of the mounds you have a bit of a dip, and they last a fair while, and sometimes a woolly sheep can get caught in the mound, lying down and can't get up. So that's just a couple of the little things that we've found with having plantations. We tend to put our thinnings have been on the ground. Our pruning, I've always done the 2 or 3 because you're around the farm all the time and seeing them. You tend to do a fair bit of pruning. But the thinnings, the first ones there were put on the ground, and the second thinnings, we actually took some to be treated as poles, and we've used them a lot as in our sheds and our fencing. Other things, we've used railings, poles, just untreated railings, poles for fences, and used them for boiler wood for when we had our fish farm. We used to have to heat the water, and so we used them for boiler wood there. And now we tend to use the thinnings that are a fair bit bigger now, but for firewood, we've been selling firewood, and also for our accommodation. People love to have a nice big fire, and I say, well, leave the red gums and from the bush and just use our thinnings from our plantations. The larger thinnings also, some of them look so good that I thought, I think I'll get a Lucas mill and actually try milling them up. They weren't actually valuable enough or look good enough to kind of pay someone to do it, because you might only get 1 or 2 rails out of them. But I thought, well, I can fiddle around and do that. So a couple of years ago, I got a Lucas mill and spent my winters doing a bit of milling. Finally, I did a little bit of carbon accounting on our farm, and the Meat and Livestock Association have put a new greenhouse accounting tool. And I thought, well, I'll give that a try. I've previously been a bit involved with Full Cam, which did the plantation accounting, but this tool actually takes into account, the emissions from your sheep and your cattle, and your farm, your electricity and your diesel, and also and even lime, I think, if you put lime on too, and your trees. And I found with our 350 lambing ewes, we produced 167 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. Nearly 90% of that was from methane from the sheep. I think these cattle people are going to realise how much methane and how much carbon dioxide equivalents that they are really producing. And to offset that, they are going to need a lot of trees. My 15 hectares of trees sequestered 253 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. So it made that our farm is in the sequestering about 82 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per hectare per year. I'm pretty pleased with that. I feel that I can probably drive a bit more, even though I try to drive a bit less and produce a bit less carbon dioxide. But it's a real thing that if Meat and Livestock Corporation say they're going to be carbon neutral by 2030, they have a long way to go, and they better start doing something, And I saw in their magazine a fella from up the Murray who's got a couple of thousand hectares. He realised that with he was a big cattle producer, and he was going to need at least 20 hectares of plantation, and there's no way that he thought he was going to be putting that in. He might put a few hectares in, but he was amazed at the amount of actually plantation. I think it was actually 20% of his farm. Was it 20% of his farm was going to be needed to put under trees to offset the emissions from his cattle? So to me, that's a real reality check, and trees again have a fantastic role to play, as Tony mentioned how they can do it, and also storing the timber and keeping growing them is the way to go.
I'll give you some rough figures there. Yep. To establish, it's somewhere in the region of 2,000 to 3,000 per hectare. So it just depends how serious you are about doing it. And it also depends on the site itself. If it needs more soil pits because of more terrain, then it's going to be an extra cost and so on. But it's in that sort of ballpark region. You've then got silviculture costs over the 20 years, and then harvesting costs and so on. But the one that's the big one up front is the first investment, the 2,000 to 3,000. As I was saying before, if you're getting carbon credits, they effectively pay for your management along the way. What you get in for carbon credits will more than pay for your silviculture. What we get in for our cows, which are agisting from someone else, is enough to pay for our ongoing management costs every year. So once you've done that investment, it can be sort of zero cost from then on. Good question. The question was, do we offset with fire insurance? And the answer is no. We looked at that at the very start because we just thought that would be sensible. And we went to various insurance companies in the forest insurance. And the premium was not all that much, but it was about 4% of the value of the forest. And if we're growing for 25 years, you multiply 25 by 4 and it comes to 100. That means 100% of your profit has gone to the insurance company when you harvest. So we figured it wasn't, we thought it's not worth doing it economically. We'd rather self-insure. If we get burnt out, well, that's life. It happens. But when we get to within maybe 3 or 4 years of harvest, then we'll rethink about insurance. Because then, having gone through the 20 years or so, to then get burnt out would be a bit of a problem. So yeah, we'll rethink down the track. It depends how you do it, but we're looking at it being the same because we wouldn't get rid of stumps. We'd plant in between the existing stumps. If you look where they're planted, these were the original spacing, these ones over here, about 2 to 3 metres spacing. When they're harvested, if they're harvested, we just plant in the middle because there's undisturbed ground between it. It'll gradually join up with the other roots. By the time the new tree is at harvest, these old roots will have degraded a lot more. So yeah, we wouldn't rip it up. We would replant. We wouldn't convert it back to a farm.
It's a Victorian tree. It's Eucalyptus tricarpa, and that's from one of my thinnings at Tagati. The trees are very small, quite small diameter, but the timber that's come from them is going to be quite usable. John Coyne is my resident miller when I can get him because he's very busy, and he mills very high quality boards from my logs. I've sold about 25 cubic metres of sawn timber in the last month or two. That's been air dried at my place for a long time, and it's been a nice little bonus for my operation. I think the species that are chosen here are not prone for insect attack. The longicorn beetle attacks the shining gum, which I have at my place, but Clinton might correct me. I don't think it attacks the blue gum. Does it, Clinton? Longicorn beetle?
Yes, it does.
Right.
Yeah, it does attack. But the key thing with longicorn borer, as with a lot of these things, you just got to keep your trees healthy. So if you thin them on time, prune them on time, you know, fertility's good. You know, you got a much better chance of not only the tree not getting infected, but if it does get attacked by something, it's going to recover fairly well. So there was one issue that Tony wanted me to talk about regarding the insects. When these trees initially went in, we did have a particular infestation of chrysomelids in the sugar gums. But as you can see, you know, they've come out of that fine. So you will get insect attack. You will get insect attack in your trees, but the trick is if you keep them healthy, they should be fine. But if you don't thin on time, you actually don't manage them, well, there's a fair chance the bottom line will be affected fairly significantly.
The idea with pruning is to start the pruning when the tree is about 8 to 10 centimetres at the top of each pruning lift. So when the tree is about 4 years old, the blue gum tree, it's about 5 metres to 6 metres high. We can prune it to half the height without slowing it down too much. The idea is to prune progressively as the tree grows. So if we're pruning the second lift to 4.5 metres, we do that when the tree is about 9 or 10 metres high, and the 6 metre prune is done when it's about 12 plus metres high. And the diameter of the tree is usually confined so that we've pruned the branches off when the tree is about 10 to 12 centimetres in diameter. So after that is clean wood without knots, because when the pruning wounds heal up, all of these blue gums that are pruned here will have a knotty core inside that's probably about 12 centimetres in diameter. All the wood that's grown over top of that will be clean without knots. You can see examples of pruned and unpruned boards at my ute.
And you'll notice as you look around that some of the trees are pruned, whereas the one on the end here has not been pruned. We've left a lot of the edge trees as shelter for the rest of the plantation, sort of wind shelter. So even though it'll never be a harvest tree, we've left it to grow on. It'll probably stay there forever.
You'll also notice that some of the trees that are unpruned have started to drop branches inside the plantation, especially with the sugar gum, which is over beyond the ute or beyond the afternoon tea table. You'll notice a lot of the lower branches are dying and even hanging down. They're in the process of falling off the tree. That's the natural pruning going on.
Oh, sorry, understory species. Yeah, just shrubs. Just any of your local indigenous shrubs, wattles, grevilleas, melaleucas, callistemon, bottle brushes. So anything that's just, and even actually coppiced trees have lower. So they need shelter. The little birds in here. There's a different suite of little birds that live down the bottom here that live up the top, and so the ones that live up the top are fine. But the ones that live on the bottom, they were here when the trees were low, but now the trees are growing that they've had to go and find somewhere else to live. And so if you can keep providing, they need somewhere to nest, which is a low shrub, like little wrens. They don't nest at the top of the tree, they nest down here. They need somewhere to nest, somewhere to eat, something to eat, so they need the little insects and things. And they need somewhere to shelter from the predators, basically. If you're a little wren and you've got a hawk coming at you, you've got to have a bit of shrub or something to be able to run into. Yeah, to me that understory is something that can, a little bit of something that can really add a lot of value if that's if the wildlife is what you're after. We really need to look after our wildlife. Because, well, a plantation that's a productive plantation is usually planted at a fairly high stocking rate, and then you wait for the trees to grow, and then you thin a bit more. But in a dry year, when you've got understory intermixed with it, then the trees are just going to dominate and pinch all, and so they're up above and they're going to pinch all the water, and you get a drought year or a really dry year, and the understory, unless it's really, really tough. There's a few species that can survive, but that's why you see wattles, often don't survive underneath. You find them on the outside, but even in an old forest, you'll barely find understory. You'll only find it after the fire or whatever. So
could you plant it later once the tree's established?
You'll never end up getting it planted later. The trees will always beat it.
Right.
I must admit, you can't go in and put understory after. No, mostly, I suppose, only from that point of view, I like planting spotted gums because they flower profusely and they attract the bees. Yeah, they're fantastic for honey and for the the squirrel gliders and the honey eaters. And I've even had region honey eater on the property because of that. So, they really have a... But I was thinking that, it's good if you're doing for timber to have all one species because it makes it easier to sell. But on a farm, and again, it depends on your objectives, having a few different species means that they might flower at different times or different type of flower and things. I mean, spotted gums are pretty good because they often flower at different times too, often during the winter, but varied out. But yeah, that's where a differences in species is good. But yeah, concentrate on one particular species if you want a good market. I can begin to answer that. Firstly, I'm interested in your fire point of view, and that's where I see an advantage of farm forestry, because if we've got our hardwood plantations scattered through the landscape and looked after, the risk of losing a resource is minimal.
The benefit of that is if you are harvested every 25 years, then if you get a fire at year 70, well, you've got 2 lots of trees and carbon off the farm, out of the forest, stored somewhere else, and you're not going to lose a lot over time. So you've got both the geographic scattering, but also the time scattering, which I think is a major thing.
I really think one of the things could be, is a price on carbon. I mean, if there'd been a price on carbon 20 years ago, I'm sure it would have happened more. What if
I think one of the issues is that farm forestry can't replace the volume of timber that's coming out of native forests, but the volume of high quality timber is much more compatible. Only about 10% of what's coming out of the native forest is going to hardwood building timber. Most of it's going for pulp. Now, we don't intend to send any of this to pulp. We've spent too much money on it to go and pulp it now. So you're going to get a much higher volume of good quality timber, which then can replace some of that. But you're going to need a network of farm forestry sites across the region. That's the critical thing. Because they by definition are small, I mean this is on probably the largest side of 50 hectares. Most are in the sort of 10, 20, 30 hectares. So you're going to need a lot of them, but again, scattered everywhere, which has those other advantages. It depends what model you're going to work it with. If you're going to have the traditional model of taking all your harvest out on trucks 100 kilometres to somewhere, then it's difficult. There's no question. What we're looking at from here down the track is to have more vertical integration of the operations. So not only do we have the land and we plant the trees, we manage the trees, but you harvest the trees, you do the milling on site, you have a whole range of things, so you're actually getting more value out of it for the people who are building the trees. and makes it more viable economically across the region. And if you've got 20 or 30 or 40 or 50 farm forestry sites and they're all coming online at different times because they're all planted at different times, then if it's portable milling, for example, that can be moved around. And so, but you have to plan that. It's not going to happen if you don't actually have a plan for doing that.
And also, when you think in Europe, Spain is just built on 2-hectare lots of timber, but they've got self-loading trucks. So, so something, every other industry has self-loading trucks, but our timber industry doesn't seem to. If we had self-loading trucks, that makes it, they can pick up, a few logs from this place and a few logs from that place and amalgamate. It makes it a lot more flexible as well when you've got smaller lots.
So one of the issues that we've had in Australia is we've tried to do forestry like we do everything else, big. We haven't been very flexible with how we've actually looked at integrating trees onto farms. So, commonly, and you guys will have experienced it in this area, I've experienced it in Gippsland. The old blue gum schemes, they wouldn't look at you unless you had at least 20 hectares, more likely 50. This sort of forestry here, like Tony said, it is a bigger scale. It's not for everybody. You can look at, there's a brochure here that talks about multi-storey farming, which talks about 2-hectare lots, single rows. There's not everybody wants to put in, they don't have the land to do this, it's too expensive. But they might have part of their farm on the boundary out the back, which they can access quite easily, where they can put in half a hectare. These sort of things shouldn't be discounted. And small farmers, I was just at a regenerative agriculture workshop a little while ago, and they said small farmers shouldn't be told to think like big farmers. All of our farms have got their pros and their cons. Well, trees have been undersold and they're very flexible. They can meet a variety of needs, and until that's recognised, it will be very difficult to achieve what we need to achieve in terms of area. So that's a really important aspect of it.
Okay, well, I'm one of the people that Clinton mentioned earlier that thought I would become rich by growing trees. And the thing that inspired me was that in New Zealand, when I left there, 10 hectares of well-managed pine trees was worth $1 million to the owner standing. No other costs, $1 million net. Tony's got 60 hectares here, I thought I've got to become rich, but unfortunately the Australian market is very different to the New Zealand market. And I have come to the conclusion that at the moment it's not viable to sell logs, but it's viable to have the logs milled, dry the timber and sell the timber. And that's what I'm currently doing. So the economics of the harvest, well, Tony just mentioned this commercial thing here was cost neutral. I shudder to think that when we come to do the final harvest that it would be cost neutral. That would be like criminal, because somebody makes a lot of money from the timber, but currently it's not the grower. But we must keep the faith and keep planting, because the world situation is showing that timber is getting more and more in demand and the supply is tightening up.
I'm not quite sure what you mean by subsidies in this case.
Well, you're saying that you've got a continuous inflow because government subsidies are providing you with a regular income to keep the thing going. Isn't that what you said?
No, you didn't say that.
Of course that's a subsidy, isn't it?
But they don't get any government income.
Subsidies.
It's only if there'd been a price on carbon. But
And there
not
isn't
a
a price on
subsidy
carbon,
either.
so you don't.
I beg your pardon.
That's not a price.
Misunderstood what you
No,
said
it's
earlier.
no
Yes.
subsidies
So
whatsoever.
maybe you're talking about the carbon credits?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, they're being developed so that those who are emitting emissions in their businesses can get to the government target of zero by 2050 by offsetting their emissions with someone else who is absorbing the emissions.
Are those figures set by governments or are they set by competition?
Competition.
Right.
There are two aspects. One is that some of those credits that are done are bought by the government at an auction, but the government's got a stated objective of paying the lowest price possible
Yeah.
as an auction. So most people don't bother going in the auction. They sell it on the secondary market because there's a whole range of industry and individuals who want to offset their operations, and they're willing to pay reasonable prices. So it's a commercial transaction, and if they don't buy it, they don't buy it. But it's not a subsidy.
All right, thank you.
All right, well look, thank you all very much for your questions. I think we might leave it at that, but of course our speakers are going to be here and there can be further conversations and questions no doubt later on.